There's a grain that held Africa's oldest secret. For 5,000 years, its bronze seeds fed civilizations where nothing else could survive. Then, in less than a century, it was nearly forgotten, called primitive, replaced by corn and wheat. But beneath the soil, something was waiting. This is the story of sorghum, the grain that sustained life before modern agriculture existed and may hold the answer to what comes after. Ancient granaries buried 5,000 years ago. Inside, sorghum seeds perfectly preserved. Archaeologists found them in 2004, still viable after 5,000 years. The people who stored them had no written language, but they understood something we forgot. In a land where wheat withered and rivers turned to dust, sorghum still gave grain. It was a fortress of life. The plant's roots reached over 8 feet deep, deeper than corn, deeper than drought. Scientists later discovered those roots could survive on 1/3 the water of wheat, enough to live through 10 summers, and the grain it produced was a miracle of engineering. Each seed contained complete protein, essential amino acids, and iron. The fields around a ripening harvest carried the scent of earth and honey. When ground into flour, it lasted years without spoiling. The Nubians called it our bread, the Ethiopians, the Malians, the Sudanese. All knew its value. For thousands of years, families gathered the grain as the stalks turned golden, crushing each seed into soft flour that fed entire kingdoms. When Arab traders arrived in 600 AD, they wrote of it with wonder. Ibn Battuta described fields that stretched beyond sight, grain that fed empires. He watched families grind it into meal, brewing it into beer that sustained them through famine. They called it the grain of life. By 1500, explorers recorded sorghum fields stretching across the Sahel, crops so vast they created their own economies. Entire civilizations lived on its harvest. The grain gave without asking for anything. But then the story took a darker turn. By the mid-1800s, the world changed. Colonial powers moved in with cotton, sugar, and conquest. To them, sorghum was not the grain of life. It was just primitive, something in the way of profit. Colonists brought wheat from distant lands. They built plantations, mills, systems of control. Sorghum, which grew freely without fertilizer or excessive water, had no place in that system. Millions of acres were converted, fields plowed under, but sorghum does not surrender easily. Even when the fields were cleared, the knowledge remained silent, patient, waiting in memory. They replaced it with corn. They dismissed it for wheat, but the wisdom went deeper than anyone guessed. Pushed to the margins, sorghum persisted. In villages, in small plots, in the hands of those who remembered. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, after decades of ignoring it, finally admitted in 1970 that sorghum feeds 500 million people worldwide. But beneath the surface, another story was unfolding. The grain was not just surviving, it was sustaining entire populations. By the early 1900s, colonial agriculture believed it had won. Millions of acres of wheat and corn replaced traditional crops. They had turned wilderness into wealth. Or so they thought. Within 50 years, the soil degraded. Rivers dried. The ground, stripped of diversity, blew away in dust storms. Monocultures began to fail, and the grain they had dismissed, the grain people called primitive, never stopped feeding the people who knew its worth. Farmers called it the survivor, and it had been there long before any border or empire. Then scientists noticed something unexpected. Where sorghum grew, the soil remained stable. Its deep roots prevented erosion, a feat few crops can manage, holding the fragile ground together. In drought conditions, where corn failed entirely, sorghum still produced. The land kept breathing. By the 1980s, agricultural scientists gave it a new name: climate-resilient crop, the silent guardian against famine. Its grain became food for millions, Its stalks became fodder, its cultivation became wisdom. What the world had called primitive had been quietly feeding humanity the entire time. So the question grew louder. If a grain could survive every drought in recorded history and nourish billions, why did the world ever turn away from it? By the 2000s, the planet began asking for it back. Droughts deepened across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Farmers searched for crops that could live on less water. That is when scientists looked again at the grain they had ignored for a century. In 2008, the USDA launched climate crop studies. The results were startling. Sorghum required 30% less water than corn and produced comparable yields in harsh conditions, all from a grain that thrived on minimal inputs. At the same time, a different crisis emerged. Industrial agriculture had depleted soils worldwide. Chemical fertilizers poisoned waterways. Farmers needed crops that could rebuild rather than extract. Then researchers turned back to ancient wisdom. In 2012, a team at Texas A&M University found sorghum's drought resistance came from its unique metabolism, a photosynthetic pathway that conserved water in extreme heat. Sorghum could close its leaf pores during the hottest hours, surviving temperatures that would kill wheat or rice. One scientist wrote, "It's the grain that adapts instead of demands." By 2015, food companies across the United States started using sorghum flour, calling it the grain of the future. Gluten-free, high in antioxidants, ancient. Prices remained affordable because small farmers had never stopped growing it. Bakers in Kansas and Ethiopia began making sorghum bread and even brewing sorghum beer. The same grain once dismissed by empires now sat on health food shelves beside quinoa and ancient wheat. Around 2016, a quiet movement began in the fields of Mali, Sudan, and rural Texas. A few farmers, elders, and agronomists wanted to bring sorghum back from margin to mainstream. They called it reclaiming the ancient grain. Many still had old seeds passed down in clay pots, preserved through generations. A Malian farmer named Amadou Diallo started planting heritage varieties again in 2017 using his grandfather's method, timing planting with the first rains. Within one season, his fields were golden with grain. He said the sight reminded him of childhood harvests when entire villages came together to thresh. What began as a small act of memory turned into a movement. By 2019, seed banks in Ethiopia and India began collecting sorghum varieties from across the world. Some had seeds red like clay, others white as bone. Botanists identified over 30,000 known varieties, each adapted to its own climate. The world was remembering what indigenous farmers had known for millennia. True resilience does not come from a laboratory. It grows quietly in the field. By 2021, the conversation around food shifted again. Global climate change was breaking records. In parts of Australia, farmland cracked. Corn yields dropped by 50%. Rivers that once fed whole regions turned to dust. Scientists started asking one simple question: what survives when everything else fails? The answer pointed back to sorghum. Climate researchers studying food security noted how its drought tolerance could feed millions as rainfall patterns changed. Governments began taking notice. In 2022, the African Union launched programs to expand sorghum cultivation across degraded lands. And because sorghum grows in arid regions across the globe, farmers in Argentina, India, and Australia joined in. The Food and Agriculture Organization called it a critical crop for climate survival. The grain that once stood as a symbol of tradition now stands as a blueprint for the future. Every seed, every stalk, every root carries a reminder. The answers to tomorrow's hunger may already be growing in the soil beneath our feet. This knowledge is not lost. It is waiting for us to remember. If this vault opened something for you and you find value in these stories, hit subscribe and the bell icon. Every like and every share helps preserve this forgotten wisdom together.